guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. So firstly, I just want to say this is my second week uploading 2 times a week, and I do just want to verify that this is not something that I can probably stick to. For me personally, it just isn't doable, but I do like uploading 2 times a week, so I think what I'm going to do is upload 2 times a week when I can. But it's not going to be something that is going on all of the time. So there will sometimes be videos 2 times a week, and sometimes there just won't be. On top of that, I'm sitting on the bed today. That is because I don't know where the heck the stool I usually sit on went, and obviously I can't sit on the floor because my legs kill me when I do that. So with that all being said, let's just get right into today's video. Today we are going to be talking about the case of Rose Lerner. Now, Rose Lerner was definitely, at this time in her life, going through what I'm going to call her angsty teenage phase. I think everybody goes through that period of their life, but Rose was definitely going through it at this time. She had 2 younger siblings, so she was the oldest of 3, and she didn't necessarily have a great relationship with her siblings. They were all very close, but it was kind of like the older sibling picking on the younger siblings kind of thing, but you could see how close they were if you knew them. If that makes sense. I personally have 2 younger sisters, so for me personally that does make a lot of sense because I feel like that's just normally how people are. But yeah, so they were close, but they had kind of that older sibling, younger sibling, I'm gonna pick on you kind of mentality going on. So Rose's parents got divorced when she was just 4 years old, and so because of this, she spent her teenage years splitting her time between her mother's house and her father's house. In 1993, when Rose was 18 years old, this is when her family would describe these as her angsty, angry teenage years, and her family also would refer to Rose jokingly as a vampire because she was up all hours of the night on the phone talking to friends. She was the type of person in that time who was always on the phone. She was constantly in contact with all of her friends. She called them multiple times a day. She was just always talking on the phone. It was one of her favorite things to do. She was also diagnosed with ADD, and so she was always really on the go unless she was sleeping. Now, something else that I saw mentioned, which I'm not really sure why it's relevant, is that Rose took 3 showers a day. So I don't really know where that comes in, but I did see it in multiple articles. Rose also was described as being a very, very friendly girl, but she did have an attitude problem, and sometimes she would get herself into trouble because she didn't know when to, hold back that attitude that she had going. And I feel like that is also something very common, especially in teenage girls. Rose's stepmother, who I'm sure is a very nice woman, but she didn't like sugarcoating things, and she described Rose as not being every mother's dream, but she said that Rose was a very generous girl, and if you ever needed anything, she was always there. Growing up, Rose had 2 best friends. One was a girl who she had met in grade 3, and this girl's name was Bailey. Her second best friend was a boy by the name of Billy Brown, and she met him in grade 5, and ever since she had met Bailey and Billy, she would split her time between the 2 of them. She would spend a lot of time with Bailey, and when she wasn't with Bailey, she was usually with Billy. When Rose was either 16 or 17 years old, her mother had her put into a mental hospital. Now, obviously there must have been something going on because I don't think that you can just administer your child to a mental hospital without having a solid reason. However, with digging, I couldn't find anything that jumped out at me saying this is why she was put into the hospital. It just seemed that Rose's mother thought that she was kind of getting out of control. She thought the house was extremely chaotic with Rose being there, and she thought that she needed a little bit of a break, so she took Rose and got her put into this mental hospital. Something that I forgot to mention here is that Rose was born and raised and continued living throughout her entire life in Lansing, Michigan. When Rose's mother initially brought her to the hospital, Rose was not happy about it at all, but her and her mom had a chat, and Rose decided that she was going to suck it up and she was going to stay there. Now, she ended up being in this facility for 3 months, and when the 3 months were up, they said that she was in great spirits and it was time for her to go home, but Rose was not ready to go home. She did not want to leave this facility. She made several friends in there, and she was even interested in a boy that was in the facility with her, so she was really not ready to go home. But obviously, you can't stay in a facility like that forever. You can't stay there just because you want to. once they deem you fit to leave, you have to leave. So obviously Rose had to go home at this point. Once Rose got sent home, she got her first job working at KFC, and at this time she started to really rebel. Her mom thought that she was doing this because she wanted to go back to that facility, but she really was just not in a good state. She started treating her siblings exceptionally bad. She started stealing. She was caught going to school drunk a couple times. She was just really rebelling, and again, her mom thought that this was so that she would get put back into that facility. Rose had already been going through a very difficult time in her life. She was again in her rebellious phase, and she was just going through those hardships of being a teenager when one day her and her friend Bailey were at the park just hanging out when this older man had taken a specific liking to Rose. Now, Rose and this man seemed to be getting along. They were chatting and hanging out and talking, and Bailey started to feel like she was almost third wheeling, so she just decided that she was going to go home, and I'm sure that her and Rose talked about this, and Rose agreed to, let Bailey leave. However, as a female, I don't think this is ever a good idea. If you're a girl and you're out with a girlfriend and your girlfriend is ever approached by an older man, you know what, any man that you don't know, anybody that you don't know, and yeah, I just don't think leaving your friends in general is a good idea. But anyways, so Rose and this man continued to hang out, and Bailey went home. A few hours later, Rose showed up at Bailey's house completely shaken up, bawling her eyes out, and that is when she told Bailey that this man had raped her. The girls decided to go to the police, which obviously is the right thing to do, and they were able to track this man down, and he confessed, but for whatever reason, he only served 1 month in prison. Like, what? How twisted is our system that an older man can prey on a child and serve 1 month in prison? Poor Rose at this time was already going through a hard time in her life, and this just obviously and understandably completely set her off. Her family said that there was rarely a day that Rose would get through without crying, which is so heartbreaking. Rose dropped out of school at 16 years old, but she did end up getting her GED, and then in the summer when Rose was 18 years old, that is when she would meet one of Billy's friends, who was named John Cahoe. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And John was a rapper. He was a little bit older than Rose, and Rose was absolutely infatuated with John. She thought that he was just the coolest guy ever. He was a rapper, he had money, he was a little bit older, and she was absolutely infatuated with him. At this time, John had also taken an interest in Rose, and so, as people do, they decided that the best thing for them to do would be to start dating, which makes sense. But after they'd been dating for a little while, Rose then went to her mother and asked if John could move in with them. He had nowhere to stay at the time, and Rose just thought that this would have been a really good idea. So her mom agreed to this. She was a little apprehensive at first, but after a while, she thought that it would be okay if John moved in. John was always really nice and really respectful of her, and she had no issue with him living inside of their home at all to begin with. But one day, Rose's mother would walk into the room that John was staying in to find money and guns spread out all over the bed. She was like, what the heck is going on? And so she called John down, and she was talking to him and talking to Rose, and that is when she found out that John was a drug dealer. Now, as any mother would do, this freaked her right out, and she decided to kick John out of the house. Now, this seemed to probably, I'm gonna assume, piss John off, because after this he started to just completely ignore Rose. He didn't answer her texts, he didn't want to see her, he wouldn't call her back, he just pretty much ghosted her after this. And this really upset Rose. It really got under her skin, and it seemed like this only made her crave his attention even more. One day after John had been kicked out of Rose's house, Rose caught wind of a party that was going on, and she heard that John was going to be there, and he was ignoring her, and she was getting angrier and angrier, so she decided to show up at this party. And I don't really know what took place before this had happened, but Rose obviously very angrily, purposely drove her van into John's van. Now, after this happened, John allegedly walked up to Rose and told her that if she didn't leave him alone, he was going to kill her. On December 6th, 1993, Rose was working the night shift at KFC. She closed up and she arrived home at around 11:30 p.m. Once she got home, she was on a phone call with a friend that her brother had overheard, and he would later say that it sounded as if Rose was in an argument with whoever she was on the phone with. Once she got off the phone, she went into the living room where her brother was laying on the couch. She told him she loved him, she would see him later, and then she left the house. And she headed towards a local convenience store, which is where her mother was working overnight. Right when Rose had showed up at the convenience store, her mom said that she could tell that something wasn't right. And she just knew that her daughter was like upset, but she didn't want to push because Rose is a teenager, she's going through that phase, and her mom just knew like whatever is going on, it will probably pass, and she didn't want to pry too much or make Rose more upset than she already was. So Rose walks into the convenience store and her mom is like, it is so cold out, it's December in Lansing, Michigan, it is not warm at all. And Rose tells her mom that she wants to go and hang out with friends. Her mom's like, it is freezing out, it is snowing, the weather is not good. Why don't you take the car? It's freezing, like don't walk, there's no point, just take the vehicle. And Rose basically was like, I'd rather walk, I'm just gonna walk, don't worry about me, I'll be home later, I love you, I'm going out with friends now. And then she left the convenience store. 8:30 the following day, that is when Rose's mother would arrive home from her night shift at the convenience store to find that her daughter was not home and she had not heard from her since the night before. This is when her motherly instincts kicked in, and she said immediately at that moment she knew that something was wrong. She didn't know what else to do, so she called police right away and told them that her daughter was missing, she hadn't come home, and police were very helpful. They started looking almost immediately. So at this time, Rose's mother was driving around trying to find her daughter, and the police were already looking for Rose. Because Billy Brown was Rose's best friend, Rose's mother's first thought was to call Billy. She called Billy's house and his parents answered, and they had told her that Billy was also not home. This was kind of comforting to Rose's mother at that time because she just assumed, you know, Bill and Rose are probably out together. So she told Billy's parents to have him call her once he got home, and he did do this, but when he called her, he said that he had no idea where Rose was and he hadn't seen. In fact, at this time, none of Rose's friends had seen her for a couple days or heard from her, and that again would be extremely alarming because like I already mentioned, Rose was constantly in contact with her friends all the time. She would call them a bunch of times during the day. She was always in contact with them. So for them to just not hear from her was very, very alarming. Rose's mother said at this time she just had this horrible gut feeling, and she felt like in her soul that she knew that Rose was gone and she was not coming back. At this time, tips started rolling into police, and many of these tips, and there was over 100, were suggesting that Billy Brown, Rose's best friend, and her ex-boyfriend, John Cahoe, had something to do with Rose's disappearance. Because of all the tips that had been filtering in that suggest that Billy Brown knew something about this case, police brought him in for questioning. Now, Billy sat down with police and they questioned him, and he denied having any involvement or any idea where Rose was. However, the police said that they knew that he was lying. They didn't know what he was lying about, but they knew at this point that he was lying. However, at this point, there was nothing that they could do about it because they didn't have any evidence. All they really had that told them that he was lying was a gut feeling. And in April of 1996, Billy Brown would call investigators and he would confess, saying that they were all, him, John, and Rose, hanging out on the night of Rose's disappearance, and that he had no involvement in Rose's murder, but he was an accessory after the fact. Billy's confession, he also said that the men had went to John's brother Timothy's house after this was all done and that they had hidden evidence there. And so because of this, a warrant was put out for the arrest of Timothy, John, and Billy. However, John had somehow gotten wind about the warrant, and because of this, him and Timothy had fled to Mexico. They went to investigate the house that Billy had told them about, which turned out to be John's grandparents' house. And while they were investigating this home, they found a single drop of blood in the bathroom, and after testing the blood, they found that this drop of blood did in fact belong to Rose Lerner. Like I mentioned, John and Timothy had fled to Mexico, and police got wind of this, and so Mexican police had arrested John and Timothy, and they shipped them back to Michigan. So now let's talk about the confession that Billy had made about what exactly happened on the night of Rose's disappearance. On the night that Rose disappeared, when she was finished work, she had allegedly called Billy and asked him if he could get a hold of John and ask if the three of them could hang out. She had told Billy that she wanted to have sex and smoke weed. Around 3 a.m. after Rose had left the convenience store after speaking with her mother, that is when John would come and pick her and Billy Brown up. Once they got into the car, they drove around for a little bit before John had pulled onto a dark side road, and that is when him and Rose started to have sex while Rose's head rested on Billy's lap. Now, I'm not sure if he is trying to hint at the fact that they were kind of like having a threesome or like there was something else going on here, but he said that her and John were having sex and Rose's head was resting on Billy's lap. After this was finished with, the three of them then started to head towards John's grandparents' house. However, John had told them that he needed to stop at the store. So he stopped at the store, he went in, Billy and Rose stayed in the car, and when he came back out, they headed back towards John's grandparents' house. Now, later on, we would find out that what John had purchased at the store was a filleting knife, 2 things of lighter fluid, and charcoal, and a bunch of garbage bags. Verified, John's grandparents were not home at this time. They were out of town. However, once the 3 of them arrived at the grandparents' home, that is where they planned to party, and John pulled out weed and cocaine, and I'm going to assume that all 3 of them did all of the drugs. I mean, not all of them, but I'm going to assume that they all partook in smoking weed and doing cocaine. And then, allegedly, John and Rose started to have sex again. Then once they were done this, the 3 of them, Billy, John, and Rose, all got into the shower together. Then once they got out of the shower, Billy and Rose stayed in the bathroom kind of drying up and brushing their hair and whatnot, and John left the washroom. John then came back into the bathroom bringing with him a cord, and once he was back in the washroom, he wrapped the cord around Rose's neck. At first, she thought that he was kidding and she laughed, but he just kept pulling this cord tighter and tighter until Rose couldn't breathe and she was collapsed on the ground. During this time, Billy, I guess, had asked John, like, "Buddy, what are you doing?" And John turned around and said to him, "This bee has got to go, and that is what is going to happen." Once Rose was unconscious on the ground, that is when John grabbed her body, put her in the bathtub, and slit her throat. Billy then left the washroom where they went to do more cocaine, and then while Billy was sitting in the living room, John took a hatchet and went back into the bathroom and started dismembering Rose's body. It is also stated that at one point he came back out of the washroom with Rose's foot on a knife, just to like show Billy what was going on. He then gathered up some of Rose's remains and he put them inside of a fire pit and he burned them until they were nothing more than ash. The 2 men then took the rest of Rose's body over 100 miles away to Billy's family's property where they planned to burn the rest of her. This next part is as if this case isn't disgusting in itself. Billy said at one point John had taken a piece of the burnt flesh and he put it on a piece of bread with mustard and ate it, saying that he just wanted to experience it. They then took all of Rose's ashes with them and dumped them along the highway while they headed towards Tim's house. Once they arrived at Tim's house, Tim told them not to worry about the hatchet or the knives in the vehicle or the shovels and that he would deal with them. And then all 3 men agreed on an alibi, saying that they were going to tell police if ever questioned that they had been at Tim's house the entire night. Billy Brown was offered only a year in prison if he testified against John, which he agreed to do. However, both men said that the other man was responsible for Rose Lerner's murder. John blamed the death of Rose on Billy, saying that he was only an accessory after the fact, whereas Billy stuck to that story that I just told you through and through. John said that after Billy realized that they were going to get caught, he collapsed and decided to confess to police, and it was just like Billy got there before John could, and that is why John was taking the blame and Billy wasn't. Last year, John Cahoe is still standing by his story, saying that he was only an accessory after the fact, and that Billy had murdered Rose because she kept shutting him down. She was not interested in having sex with him, and Billy couldn't handle this, and he couldn't handle seeing Rose interested in John, and so he decided to kill her, and that is how that all played out, and that John is just an accessory after the fact. However, Billy obviously is still standing by his story, and he claims to have only helped John cover up the murder so that John would not murder him as well. John testified at his own trial in 1997, saying that he did not kill or eat Rose, and he still maintains his innocence to this day. John Cahoe was charged with first-degree murder and is serving time in prison today without the possibility of parole. My heart sincerely goes out to the family and the loved ones of Rose Lerner. This case is such a sick and twisted case. I can't even imagine what the family went through. This is so messed up. Imagine trusting somebody the way that Rose must have trusted Billy Brown and John Cahoe, and for them to do something like this to her, I just can't even fathom like the anger and the hurt and all of the emotions that the family and her loved ones must be going through in connection to what happened to her. This case is something else. It is so sickening. But guys, that is going to bring us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.